Hello, everyone. I'm Mariette DiCristina, the Dean of the Boston University College of Communication. I'm also an alum of the college and the parent of a recent BU grad. Welcome to today's COMtalk panel, Telling Our Stories, Indigenous Representation in the Media, organized with the support of the college's wonderful DEI committee. Since 2021, several highly praised shows such as Reservation Dogs, Killers of the Flower Moon, and Rutherford Falls have played important roles in highlighting and celebrating Indigenous storytelling, while dispelling stereotypes of Native Americans. Despite these efforts, representation of Native Americans in the entertainment industry remains low, and the number fewer than 1% working in the field. Clearly, there's much work to be done to increase the visibility of Indigenous peoples in the media, raise awareness of the injustices affecting their communities, and pay homage to their traditions and cultures. This COMtalk will explore how Native and non-Native individuals can effectively and respectfully engage with and support Indigenous stories. The faculty, staff, and students of the Boston University College of Communication acknowledge that the territory on which Boston University stands is that of a Wampanoag and Massachusetts people. Our college and the Boston University campus are places to honor and respect the history and continued efforts of the Native and Indigenous community leaders which make up Eastern Massachusetts and the surrounding region. This statement is one small step to acknowledging the history that brought us to reside on the land and to help us seek understanding of our place within that history. Today, Boston is still home to Indigenous peoples, including the Mashpee, Wampanoag, and Wampanoag tribe of Gay Head, Aquinnah. This free virtual event will be recorded. A copy of the recording will be emailed to registrants and posted to the College of Communications YouTube channel under our virtual series playlist. Now let's welcome our wonderful panelists. First, let's say hello to Angel Charley, who is Executive Director of IllumiNative. Angel is a distinguished Indigenous leader and advocate dedicated to ending violence against Native women and girls. As the former executive director of the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women, she's been instrumental in promoting visibility and systemic transformation around gender-based violence. As a citizen of the Pueblo of Laguna and Navajo Nation, she focuses on empowering Indigenous communities and addressing their challenges. In 2019, she was appointed to the New Mexico Murdered and Missing Indigenous Relatives Task Force, and she's been involved in advocacy efforts recognized by the New Mexico State Senate. She's also participated in the White House Gender Policy Indigenous Women Trilateral Work Group and has testified before Congress, advocating for increased visibility and systemic change to address gender-based violence against Native women and girls. Charley also holds a degree in liberal arts from the University of Hawaii. Hi there. Hi there, Angel.
Good morning. Thank you all for having me. Excited to be here.
Awesome to have you here. Thanks a million. Now let's say hello to Cristina Coates-Cornejo, Professor of Film and Digital Production and Director of BFA program at Emerson College. Raised in the U.S. and Argentina in a bilingual, bicultural family, Cristina is a descendant of the indigenous Huape people, of the Cuyo region of what is now Argentina. She received an MFA from New York University's Tisch School of Arts, an MA in Organizational Arts Management from Antioch University, and a BA in International Relations from the University of Southern California. Cristina's debut film, Tres Americas, just screened at domestic and international festivals and was distributed by Vanguard Cinema and represented by Cinetech Media's Film Buff. Her documentary short film, Jewel and the Catch, was selected by Outfest to be part of the Outfest UCLA Legacy Project of the UCLA Film and Television Archive. Her 360-degree documentary, The Root is More Important Than the Flower, has played at multiple film festivals, including Maoriland, Waiora Maori Film Festival, Imaginative International Festival of Indigenous Art and Cinema at Mapu, among others. Cristina is also a contributing author in Filming Difference, Actors, Directors, Producers, and Writers on Gender, Race, and Sexuality in Film, University of Texas Press, edited by Daniel Bernardi. And Cristina also teaches media production at Emerson College. Thanks for joining us, Cristina.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
We appreciate you. Thank you. And now let's say hello to Sarah Lisi, journalist at KOSU, an NPR station. Sarah Lisi is Diné and an enrolled member of the Turtle Mountain Band of the Chippewa Indians. Her grandmother, Mary Morris, gave her the name Twilla, which means sparkle upon the water. So pretty. Sarah's passion is heart-centered storytelling. She currently works as an Indigenous Affairs reporter at KOSU, joining the team in April 2024. Before that, she created mini documentaries with Federal Public Defense Office in Mississippi, telling the stories of defendants and their families. She also worked as a researcher with Dr. Victoria Lapeau at Ohio University, where she received her Master of Science degree. She co-authored the 2021 Spotlight Report for the Indigenous Journalists Association, shining a light on the stereotypical news coverage in the mainstream media. And while at school at OU, she was awarded the Outstanding Master Student Award in 2022 from the EW Scripps School of Journalism. Sarah presented her findings at the International Indigenous Climate Change Research Summit and the International Indigenous Research Conference and received multiple fellowships from the Sundance Institute and the Indigenous Journalists Association. We're so lucky to have you here today, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here with a lot of accomplished matriarchs.
Awesome. And now I will shortly turn over the virtual mic to Taylor Morales, who is a California native, Boston-educated screenwriter. Her passion for storytelling has been an amplifier for her intersectional advocacy efforts. Taylor was the recipient of Boston College's Jacques Salamanowitz Film Grant for Moral Courage for her documentary work on the residential schools in British Columbia in 2021. She's currently finishing up her last year of grad school here at Boston University and working on pre-production for her next documentary, shining a light on the struggles of physically disabled individuals on reservations across the nation. Thanks a million, Taylor. I'm going to turn the mic over to you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. I just wanted to let everybody who's listening in know that we are going to be using the Q&A function on Zoom this morning to ask and pose any questions for the last 15 minutes of this COMtalk so that our panelists are able to respond to any questions that you might have as we're answering our pre-planned questions. So please feel free throughout this conversation to throw your questions into the Q&A function, and we'll make sure to save a little bit of time at the end to address them. But let's get into it. Our first question for today are, what barriers still prevent Indigenous people from achieving greater visibility in the entertainment industry? And how can we overcome these challenges?
Well, I can take that question if no one else wants to chime in. You know, the reality is that the entertainment industry really doesn't operate like most other places of employment. It, you know, really operates on who you know and networking. So if you're an outsider to the system, it makes it harder to gain access. So knocking down those barriers comes down to figuring out what that access is. You know, it can be in the form of talent development programs for BIPOC writers, directors, and producers that currently exist. These programs really have helped people find work and gain access to the industry. Hopefully, you know, due to our political landscape, I'm hoping that the entertainment industry is really committed to this because, you know, DEI and the political landscape are at odds with each other. So, you know, the other factor is that gatekeepers in the industry are really in control of who gets to tell stories. So, you know, we need more Indigenous studio heads. We need allies that will, you know, greenlight projects and to really get those gates fully opened for once. Also needed are Indigenous producers and showrunners to create films and shows that then hire Indigenous creatives, writers, directors, cinematographies, production designers, and then ultimately create shows that center Native American stories. For an example, Sterling Harjo and Taika Waititi created Reservation Dogs, and we see they've, you know, providing opportunities for actors and crew, and we need more of this. And And while I'm a huge fan of Martin Scorsese, I really wished he had put his name and stature behind a Native filmmaker to tell Killers of the Flower Moon, that story. We need Indigenous perspectives on these stories as well. Now, the upside to that film was Lily Gladstone's Oscar nomination, which gave attention on Indigenous visibility in the industry, and also drew attention to the lack of representation that exists. These are some of the barriers and some of the ways we can access as well. Fortunately, too, that exhibition venues now are more accessible due to streaming platforms, because before getting work seen was just as hard as getting into the industry. This is one upside that has evolved with modern technology, and it benefits everyone. So those are a few of my ideas, and I'm happy to continue, sharing more about that.
Thank you, Christina. I think that that's a really great transition into this next question. How can non-Native creators, actors, and producers ensure that they're engaging with these Indigenous stories in a way that's both respectful and also actively avoiding reinforcing these stereotypes that we've seen in the media in the past?
I can jump in and build off what Christina said in terms of employing more Indigenous creatives. And that looks like not just having one Indigenous creative on your team, but having multiple voices that have a say and can bounce ideas off of each other. Speaking from personal experience, I grew up in St. Louis, and I went to a small Catholic school, and I think I was the only Native American in my class. And often whenever we learned about Native American history, any battles fought with a tribal nation, my teachers kind of looked at me to say something. And I remember feeling such an enormous pressure of like, I'm just one person, I hope I don't get this wrong. And I think, looking at it from that perspective, having just one Indigenous creative is not enough. That's a big weight to put on someone's shoulders. So hiring multiple Indigenous talent, producers, in all the different areas of production is huge. But I think that there are also a lot of really great resources out there, a lot of nonprofits that have done the work to provide resources for filmmakers, for producers, for people in the media, even journalists like myself. I've done some work with the Indigenous Journalists Association, and they've provided resources to avoid using Native American stereotypes and looking at the harm in overusing those. And IllumiNative too, they also have a lot of great resources that talk about the right way to approach telling Indigenous stories. And just to reiterate again, it just means hiring Indigenous creatives. But there are resources out there, and I think nonprofits to collaborate with to make sure that you're doing the due diligence and telling Indigenous stories.
Yeah, and I'll just thank you, Sarah, for uplifting IllumiNative. We're a national nonprofit who is focused on amplifying and uplifting contemporary Native voices, and ultimately our representation to build power for Native people. And so some of the resources that Sarah was talking about, you can find on our website. We have industry guides for professionals around, how to have these conversations, the things that you should be thinking about behind the screen, in front of the camera, and all of the places in between. But ultimately, it comes down to resources, opportunities, access, and advocacy from our allies. IllumiNative has done a couple of initiatives over the years. We've partnered with Amazon on a directors program, and Netflix with a producers program, and Sundance for an Indigenous list program, to ensure that folks from our community have access to these places where decisions are being made and stories are being told, because storytelling is one of the most powerful tools we have for impacting the perception and ultimately policy for our communities, outcomes for our communities. And so all of those, again, can be found on our website at illuminative.org.
Yeah, can I add to that? I mean, I'm in academia. I teach in a college, and we're in a film program, and so we're like the pipeline in many ways to the industry. So it's important that at this stage that students understand, representation, and the resources should be, that you're both talking, Sarah and Angel, need to be shared at this level, so that people are educated, before they get to the industry. And I would encourage students out there to make themselves available to IllumiNative's resources and other resources that are out there that I know that this that BU is making access to. So that's important.
Awesome. Well, bearing in mind the resources not only through IllumiNative, but also through our resource guide that we will be providing along with this talk, what are some of the most effective ways for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous individuals to support these Indigenous creators in the media? And are there any specific actions or strategies that these people can use in tangent with these resources to really help amplify those voices?
I can just jump in. It's actual investment and resources, right? So that are going to be behind everything, that all of the stories that are being told. So it's like at the university level, an investment in the curriculum and education that is preparing students to begin a career in media. And then on the industry level, it's ensuring that there are resources and strong advocacy behind those decisions that are being made. We partnered with the Norman Lear Media Impact Project last year, the year before. We had a report finalized last year that analyzed 51 media pieces from Rutherford Falls to Reservation Dogs to Yellowstone. And actually what we found was that when Indigenous-led content is centered and that's what is aired, people are more likely to support our actual policy initiatives. So audiences who watched Reservation Dogs, for instance, were more likely to support the Indian Child Welfare Act, and audiences who viewed Rutherford Falls were more likely to support trust treaty obligations of the federal government, whereas audiences who viewed something like Yellowstone were less likely to support that same policy initiative around the trust obligations of the federal government to tribes. But when you start to break all of that down, it's the nuance of the story. It's exactly how the story gets told. It's the characters and how they're centered. And so all of this matters when we're telling these stories. And part of the work at IllumiNative is to ensure that this influx of Indigenous created content isn't just a moment, that we ensure that it's a movement that we continue to invest in. So back to that, like, it takes real investment and intention to tell these stories.
Yeah, I would also add that, audiences need to seek out this work and watch, the shows that are out there. And the entertainment industry is a business, and so it relies on eyes on the screen, and so people can support Indigenous creatives by supporting the work itself, by seeing the work, by following through with any other filmmakers that they come across. So that's one of my ideas about how that could be supported.
Just to build on top of that, especially what Angel said, there's one of my favorite quotes by Tara Haska, who's a tribal attorney. She said, "When you aren't viewed as real people, it's a lot easier to run over your rights." And I think that speaks to a lot of what Indigenous creatives are trying to create right now is bringing these issues to the forefront so people understand the issues that we're facing at large, and humanizing our experiences so people can care and take action.
I'd like to take this opportunity to just remind any of the attendees that the Q&A function is open for any questions that you might have. I've seen a couple come through. I'm just reminding as we've hit this 20-minute mark to continue to input those for us for the end. Speaking to the unique vehicle that the media is for getting people interested in political activism and issues surrounding Indigenous communities in our country, I'd really like to talk about the MMIP and MMIR, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous People or Relatives, conversations that are kind of at the forefront of some of the political activism and conversations that are happening within Indigenous communities right now. If anybody could speak to what this is and why should we be talking about it? How can we responsibly engage in these conversations and uplift it through different media channels?
I can jump in first. And for those who aren't familiar with the crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous people, relatives, girls, Two-Spirit, it's a grassroots movement that really took place to address the systemic racism, jurisdictional complexity, and chronic underfunding of this issue. So Indigenous women are 2.5 times more likely to experience violent crime. More than 4 in 5 Indigenous women will experience violence in their lifetime. More than half of that will actually be sexual violence. And when we go back to this issue of jurisdiction, there's only a handful of tribes in the United States that can prosecute non-Native offenders for violent crimes that happen on tribal land. And then you layer onto that this chronic underfunding that has happened over the course of hundreds of years, an inability to really address this and to implement the Violence Against Women Act, which allows tribes to prosecute non-Native offenders. It requires an entire overhaul of a justice system that exists within a tribal community. And then the systemic racism. So these big federal agencies, they don't talk to each other. It's too easy for, if the crime happens on a tribal land, if a rape happens on a tribal land or a violent crime, the tribe can't prosecute that. So then it becomes a federal jurisdiction matter. And then you layer in all of the different types of jurisdictions that exist within a community, and it just creates the opportunity to bypass or pass off this issue to another jurisdiction or another entity addressing it. And so it's this really complex issue that affects our women, our children, and actually our men at a disproportionate rate. And then when we are talking about, so that's the issue. And then you talk about what Sarah mentioned earlier, our invisibility. This is one of the fundamental things that our research has told us at IllumiNative, is that our invisibility is one of the root causes of the systemic oppression we face. And so when we're thinking about like, how do we tell these stories, right? This whole really complex issue, what we have found is that the stories that are being told center around the violence that occurred, the disappearance or the murder itself, and not the complexity, the joy, the humanity of one individual's experience. So, Abigail Echohawk says it very beautifully, that we need to center on stories of the lives that these people lived and not what happened to them. Where overwhelmingly this is what happens, media, mainstream media, news, and even films that are told focus on that pain and not the joy and the lives that these people lived. And so these stories don't get covered the same in media. There's a propensity for victim blaming that happens. And so what folks can do about this is seek those stories and tell the full breadth of the story of individuals.
Yeah, I don't really have that much to add. Angel, you you spoke so great to this issue. I think the only thing that I can contribute in terms of like thinking about this in the journalistic landscape is that I recently attended a panel that the Indigenous Journalists Association put on, and two researchers hosted the panel, and one researcher, I believe, was from Canada and the other one was from the United States, and they did a survey within both countries, and asked Indigenous people of Indigenous communities from all different nations, what issues do you want to see covered in the media? And the resounding answer was missing about the MMIP crisis, MMIR crisis. And so I think that there is a lot of room to tell these stories, but as Angel pointed out, to tell them in the right way to really humanize the people affected in this issue and not victimize them. So I think that's definitely something to consider, and something I'm considering too in my work as I approach these stories.
I'd like to pose the question to all of you. What are some of these success stories when we talk about like things that are currently present in the media, whether it's in film and television, whether it's in the news, whether it's through social media channels? What media have you been consuming that you think is successful in telling these stories in a way that's not only responsible, but also engaging, and that kind of supports this rhetoric that we're hoping to shift, which is focusing less on what has happened to people and more on like uplifting in a positive way the lives of these people?
I've coming across shows that are created by Indigenous people. Murder in Bighorn is a show that I know has writers that are Indigenous writers. Dark Winds, Night Raiders. One show that I'd be curious to ask you as well, since we're having this kind of roundtable conversation, is I'm curious about the True Detective, Night Country. I watched that series and was still kind of unsure about what I thought about the Indigenous representation. I know the actor had a lead role in that show, but that's I consume shows that really are. I try to consume shows that are primarily led by the Indigenous voices, and so those are the ones that I've recently. The Killers of the Flower Moon I've had problems with. I'll admit that, and again, because it's centering white stories, kind of marginalizing the Indigenous perspective. And like I said before, I wish a different voice had told the story.
I can kind of speak to something that is going on in something that I'm keeping my eye on right now in Oklahoma. There's two tribal nations here that are taking a stand against media portrayals of their people. So I don't know if y'all have seen Yellowstone, but it's definitely one of those shows that people are familiar with. And Taylor Sheridan was the co-creator on Yellowstone. So he recently purchased the rights to the book Empire of the Summer Moon, which is about the rise and the fall of the Comanche Nation. And recently the Comanche Nation passed a resolution denouncing the book. Ultimately, I watched the business committee meeting, and they want to say in the upcoming production that Sheridan's going to produce. I'm not sure if it's going to be a movie or a TV show yet, but I know that they're kind of worried that they're going to, base this off the book, maybe not have a lot of Indigenous creatives, and they want to say in what's going to be told about their nation. So stay tuned for what happens with that. I'm really not sure what's going to come of that. But also involving Taylor Sheridan again. He was the creator of Tulsa King, which is a Paramount Plus TV show. And in a recent episode of Tulsa King, titled Heroes and Villains, Quapaw leaders were depicted in a criminal conspiracy with wind energy and cannabis. And Quapaw leaders of the tribe recently said that they weren't consulted in this episode in the production, and are really hurt by the depiction of their nation and of their leaders. But I do know that they are having talks with Taylor Sheridan and Paramount Plus and the producers to kind of, you know, remedy the situation. So again, you know, it's still like not consulting Indigenous communities, Indigenous leaders. It's still ongoing today. And I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens. But I think having talks like this is so important to raise awareness of these issues and, you know, do better in the future.
I just, hearing both of you speak just re-emphasizes for me, or what's like coming up for me is, I mean, it matters so much how our stories are told. It matters who's telling our stories. And in preparation for this talk this morning, we started to pull together some of the statistics from some of the research that we do. That's another piece of IllumiNative's work, is it's research-led and all grounded in research. And back to this Norman Lear report, of the 51 shows that were analyzed, 67% had no Native writers, directors, or executive producers. A quarter of them had one Native writer. Nearly a quarter had at least one Native director, 4% had more than one, and 16% had at least one Native executive producer, and 4% had one or more than one. And it's like, just reading that, I know it's like Reservation Dogs. So back to your original question, Taylor, like that's what I continue to consume. And you know, if we can recreate what happened with Reservation Dogs, where it was a litany of Indigenous writers, producers, showrunners, all of these Native creatives came together to tell this story of tribal youth. And even the central issue, right, was around mental health and illness and suicide. But to be able to tell that story is so complex, and it created an opportunity for real healing and real conversations in our community, and then just understanding outside. I mean, those are the kind of shows that I want to watch and I want to see. And we have another set of research that's coming out in early 2025, where we partnered with Nielsen about there is a demand for these types of shows, for this type of content to be out there in the world, authentic, genuine stories told from impacted people.
Thank you so much for responding. I talked to the panelists briefly about this. A lot of the work that I personally have been involved in has been very heavy, very full of sorrow, intensity. I think all of us can relate to that, kind of sitting here today. And I think it's so important when we're having these conversations to highlight the opposite, which is joy. And so I wanted to kind of finish these pre-prepared questions with an opportunity for each of our panelists to share an experience that they've had surrounding Indigenous joy, and sharing some light and perspective on the joy and the beauty within these communities to the public, and to kind of also kind of emphasize that it's not just a stagnant fight. It's not just sorrow, and it's not violence, but it's also joy, and there's life. And I think there's a lot of beauty that we can talk about. So however you interpret that, each of the panelists, if you want to take a moment to respond to that.
I can start in terms of my own work. You know, I often think of, you know, I consume a lot of thrillers and shows that could be dark, but that are also intellectual. In my own work, I do find that when I write, I do look at writing stories that uplift the human condition. And I made the 360 film that was mentioned in my bio was really honoring my ancestors. It was a 360 film about my own journey of connecting to my Indigenous roots with the Huarpe people. And, for me, that was such a soul-filling experience. And, I was able to share that story. I thought I was being kind of narcissistic and writing, making this film about my own experience, and was never intended to share with the world. But then I finished it and people were like, you should submit it to festivals. And I did. And it was amazing how it connected to people. People were moved by my experience, and it can be universal. In my case, it was connecting to my Indigenous ancestors who did have a very traumatic past, but I was connecting to people now who, are celebrating and reclaiming their identities, reclaiming their culture, reclaiming their language. And it was very eye-opening. And so when I think about joy, I think about that experience, and it's something that, I want to expand on in my work.
Yeah, I can hop into, I think, being a reporter here in Oklahoma City, covering, the 39 tribal nations here, a common thread that I see throughout is just community, people uplifting each other, no matter what tribal nation it is. I just see a lot of people coming together to support one another, ego aside. We're doing what we can to uplift one another. And I think that's such a beautiful sentiment. And that's often where I see a lot of joy. And like Christina said too, the reclamation of a lot of things, language, culture, identity. There's been a big push here in Oklahoma public schools to teach Indigenous languages. And it's really cool to see. And there's often been, there's research shown that when Indigenous children reconnect with their culture, with their language, it improves mental health outcomes. So I think that there are a lot of exciting things that are happening that tribal nations are doing across Turtle Island. And that's part of the work that I want to do is talking about the good, the history. It's hard to talk about, but it's important to talk about. But it's also equally important to shed light on the beautiful, joyful, humorous things. I think what Reservation showed us is that Indigenous people are funny, and I think we should highlight that. So I think the sense of like empowerment that I'm seeing is so beautiful. And yeah, it makes me excited to do this work.
I'll just add that, yeah, I mean, our people are so funny. And, there's never a time where I'm not around my family, friends, or in community where we're not just laughing. There's an abundance of joy and humor from our people. And I want that told. And when I came to IllumiNative, it was from running a more grassroots, direct service adjacent organization that was working at the intersection of gender-based violence and all of these different systemic oppressions. And so coming over to IllumiNative, so much of the work that I get to focus on now is about the joy. It is about our stories being told in an authentic and uplifting, empowering way, where we're centering Indigenous excellence and all of the beauty of our communities. And so it's a real blessing to get to be on what feels like this side of the storytelling and advocacy, and getting to be a part of every single day doing something about this. And that just continues to feed my soul, and brings me joy and healing. And it offers that healing both forward and backward to the people in my own lineage. But I really believe that it offers healing and joy to my ancestors, to see so many of us doing this work now here.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. I want to shift us into the Q&A section. of this panel. So the first question posed, what are some ways to foster meaningful engagement in classrooms and on campuses?
I guess, inviting, I guess it's a question referring to filmmakers, or is it a broad question?
I think a general question.
General question.
Yeah.
In my field, I guess in media production at a school, is really inviting filmmakers, BIPOC filmmakers, Indigenous filmmakers to campus, and having, in Q&As, we invited, when I was the chair of the department, we invited Sky Hopinka to campus, and he shared his work. It's amazing. It was eye-opening for students. We make an effort to bring, a diverse group of artists on campus. And so that's a meaningful way to have students and faculty engage with artists, Indigenous BIPOC artists.
I think one of the things that's, because I went to boarding school all throughout high school, and I happened to go to boarding school with Dallas Goldtooth and Migazi Pinsino, who are brothers, and they had a impromptu film club, right? Where all of the students would just come together and watch all of these movies. And it was so clear what track that they were on. But I think about, what are the opportunities to bring these stories into your campus and have meaningful discussion and conversation around them as well, because that was so important to where we are in some of the conversation we're having today. And so just a small idea, but yeah, consume this kind of media is what I would say.
Dovetailing off of that, one of our attendees asked, what would your advice be for your industries to make sure they're telling authentic, accurate Indigenous stories all year long, not just Indigenous Peoples Day?
Well, the entertainment industry really needs to fund more. It's what we're talking about in this panel, right? Creating more work by Indigenous filmmakers of all kinds. The uplifting stories, the fun shows, as we're talking about the comedies, and there needs to be more investment in those stories, human investment, financial investment, because as Angel's saying, there's a demand for it. But it, like I said at the top of this panel, is that there are gatekeepers that have. It's an elite industry, frankly, and that's the thing that we're trying to dismantle, the system of, the certain voices that get to tell everyone what is going to be made. So this is an active, continuing struggle that, there's progress being made, and, we just have to keep going in that direction so that we're getting more and more content out there for the demand that exists.
Yeah, I think it just comes, go ahead.
Sorry. No.
I mean, just simply put, I just think it means prioritizing Indigenous stories and doing the research to see why that's important. I think a lot of Indigenous people are leading the change to environmental issues and protecting the earth, and we're doing a lot of important things on the ground. And there's a lot of issues that I think people should care about. And yeah, at the end of the day, it's making it a priority to tell these stories and not just do it during Indigenous Peoples Day or Native American Heritage Month. Our stories are relevant year round.
Part of our advocacy, and yes to everything Christina and Sarah said, but part of our advocacy at IllumiNative is to hire Native creatives. And it's not just around a project, but it's institutionalize this knowledge. in these within these institutions, so that it's not just a DEI initiative, so it's not just an afterthought, that Native folks aren't coming in after the fact to rubber stamp something that's already been created, but it's investment from the start, and institutionalizing that presence is important and so needed.
Another question that kind of built off of that is, what do you think Indigenous filmmakers can do to create a film and TV industry that is independent, standalone, and self-sufficient, bearing in mind gatekeeping and institutional access issues?
That's the $1 million question. Literally, we need millions of dollars. No, I mean, I'm joking, but it you know, making media is costly, but there are ways to explore, you know, filmmaking independently so that it is revenue generating, and that's always the trick. Like, people make movies and shows and programs all the time. It, you know, once cameras became digital, it made it accessible. So accessibility to the equipment to make work is there. But to make, you know, something that can get in front of audiences, that can afford, you know, hiring crews and paying actors, that's where it gets more complicated. These are expensive endeavors. And so figuring out how to, you know, perhaps collectives of filmmakers, which has been something that has been done in the past, you know, we need to revisit that. You know, collectives of independent filmmakers supporting each other and creating an industry outside of this industry, which I think needs to happen. That's really where the answer is.
I do want to plug Sundance because they do have an Indigenous team there. And I know that Bird Running Water specifically, I'm pretty sure he was like a mentor to Sterling Harjo, kind of getting up in the film industry. And I think having more spaces to foster Indigenous creatives and their growth and to empower them and have them work through imposter syndrome, you know, because I think, at least I know that I face imposter syndrome a lot, you know, especially growing up and not seeing a lot of Native representation on screen. It's like, who am I to do that, you know? And I think having more programs and building more Indigenous teams in these important spaces is crucial, is really important.
Yes. I'm so excited to just share with this community that IllumiNative is launching IllumiNative Entertainment, and we will be producing, creating commercially viable films, content for consumption for our people. It is created by us. You know, after a certain point, we couldn't keep advocating for the consultant model, right? What I was talking about earlier, hiring people to come in and rubber stamp or coming in for moments at a time. But we're invested in this movement and ensuring that our stories are told by us and in a way that uplifts and centers the things that we want uplifted and centered. And so keep checking back. Early 2025, IllumiNative Entertainment is coming to life.
Congratulations.
That's great.
Our next question: at a high level, what would it mean for this nation, politically and culturally, to fully engage in this conversation in this political moment? In what ways could the nation benefit from the wisdom of Indigenous communities?
It's like, it's such a big question. It's such a big, beautiful question, right? And it's challenging me to kind of like imagine and in the moment. But what came up for me initially was Indigenous people are 5% of the world's population, but we're protecting 80% of the world's biodiversity, right? And so it's like Indigenous wisdom is the way forward in so many ways. And it's just remembering and centering always the people who are most impacted by some of these huge systemic oppressions because they're living that, they're closest to the solutions, they know what's going to work. And so it's championing that as a tenet of advocacy, is centering the people who are most impacted and affected. I don't know if that answered the question, but that's just what came up for me.
I see hesitant stares.
Yeah, I feel like that's such a big question. I need like a whole day to ponder it.
Exactly.
Well, putting a pin in that, I will come back to it at the end because I think it's a really important question. I have a question that says, I think Indigenous communities need to be covered more in news, but as someone who is not Indigenous, what advice do you have for covering different Native communities? I want to write more stories that highlight Indigenous voices, but also be mindful about it. How can I get involved as a non-Native person, a young student journalist?
Cool, some journalism representation in the house. That's good to hear that you're wanting to approach stories in the right way. And I just want to bring up Indigenous Journalists Association again because they've been instrumental in my journey as a journalist. I got a fellowship with them in 2017, and I've just been a part of the community ever since. But the good news for you as a non-Indigenous person or anyone listening to this is that you can still be an Indigenous Journalists Association member, even if you aren't Indigenous. And so there's a lot of webinars that they do. They have, like I said, the Naja Bingo card. They have a bunch of different ways on how to approach storytelling. In a way that is not harmful to Indigenous communities. And I think one thing that I've taken away a lot is, you know, thinking about what voices am I privileging in this story? In a lot of mainstream news that I've seen, it's often like a white expert is like the first source used. And I think when thinking about Indigenous communities, thinking about who is the expert, and thinking about the Indigenous people that do have wisdom and knowledge, and that it's important even if they aren't a doctor or you know what I mean. And so I think approaching it with thought and care and being involved in community where there are Indigenous journalists that you can bounce ideas off of, you can network, and yeah, and have people by your side when approaching maybe stories that are harder to tell. So I think they're a really great resource, and just consuming more news by Indigenous journalists and seeing how they're approaching things, as well, I think would be really helpful.
Our next question, how does everyone feel about Native American names of places and sports teams, etc., used today without any input from the Indigenous people that it represents? Should these names be changed, especially names of towns in the northeast of the US?
I have to do a big inhale for this one. A big part of IllumiNative's work has been around mascots and this controversy and conversation. And it's important to recognize that the fight to change the Washington Commanders name, was decades in the making, but we had this perfect storm of elements several years ago to be able to pull together movement, organizers, to see that shift happen all the way through. So, when I think about what is possible, that is what it's the biggest it's the NFL, right? To create the kind of groundswell and advocacy and visibility for this issue to actually change that racist name to the Washington Commanders. It reminds me of what is possible. And it's so important that we have these conversations and that Native people are centered in this. And we want to see those change, right? Caricatures, stereotypes of our people perpetuate our dehumanization, our invisibility. And ultimately, this is the root cause of so much of the systemic oppression that continues to be normalized and perpetuated against our people. And so it's a foundational question and conversation for so many of us to be having, but it is possible. This change is possible.
I would just plug Stephanie Freiberg's research about mascots, and you just read for yourself kind of the impacts of what they do to Indigenous youth.
This next question is more for Christina. Before it was a movie, Killers of the Flower Moon was a narrative nonfiction book written by David Gran, who is not Native. Do you think he did a good job representing Indigenous voices in his book? What about the movie? Were these stereotypes you talked about present in the movie also in the book?
I did not read the book, so I don't have knowledge of the source material. I do feel that there was a lack of representation on the side of the Indigenous people in that story. That the Indigenous people were marginalized within that story, in my opinion, and so I found that problematic. We didn't see they are speaking about the Indigenous community, and yet we're not really seeing them. And the main character, the Indigenous female character, is pretty much ill the entire movie, and doesn't demonstrate agency within her own life. And so those are problems I found. There's more issues that I find in the film itself, but again, it's, it does center, I can understand centering the story on these, despicable white men to some degree, but that's, to me, when you're telling a story that is also about the Indigenous people and the harm that was caused them, and we don't see them in the movie in any kind of significant manner, I just found that to be extremely problematic.
I also want to say about the film, when it was originally scripted, Leonardo DiCaprio the story was this savior FBI agent who was coming into the community to save, and the advocacy of the Osage Nation about how that story was being told and depicted with another white savior changed, right? And so it was a huge improvement on the way the story was originally drafted and intended to be told. And we can have these things and critique them still. And that's an important part of our own advocacy. And I think everyone's here. But yeah, thank you.
The last thing I want to circle back to that political question and maybe tune it in just slightly. We are approaching an election. A lot of these Indigenous voices, a lot of media that I've been exposed to has surrounded kind of the charging is the incorrect word, the kind of rallying of Indigenous communities to go and get people out to vote, talking about like making voting accessible, making sure that people are informed voters across the US. Does anybody have anything that they'd like to add right before we end about kind of the impact of all of this knowledge that we've talked about today and this upcoming election, how we can kind of go and get out and vote and make some changes, hopefully?
I just think one thing to consider, I had the privilege of interviewing Rebecca Nagel about her new book, By the Fire We Carry. And she talks a lot about the Supreme Court and how the health of our democracy is kind of evident in how the Supreme Court, in sort of the justice for Indigenous people. And she ultimately argues that the health of our democracy is not well in terms of the rulings that we have seen. And so I just think that's one thing to consider is thinking about the Supreme Court and Indigenous justice. She recently published an article, Indigenous Sovereignty is Under Attack as Supreme Court Bends Rules for Settlers. I think it's a good read that I'd recommend, as well as her new book that just came out.
Think we are out of time, unfortunately, but this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you to the panelists for coming and speaking and sharing your backgrounds and shining some light about telling our stories in the media and Indigenous representation. Look forward to kind of circling back with everybody, hopefully, in the future. But thank you for everybody who came today, and thank you to COMtalk for giving us a platform to have this conversation this afternoon.